Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland, and in this video, I want to talk about Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey. Well, he's a figure who's in the news a lot. His country's a consequential one, and it's making its strength felt in the region and further afield. So, President Erdogan is a highly tendentious figure. Incidentally, for those who don't speak Turkish, and I scarcely speak it myself, notice it's not pronounced Erdogan. The G with a breve over it in Turkish is silent. So Erdogan has been a pivotal figure in Turkish politics for a quarter of a century now, because it's 1994 when he became mayor of Istanbul. So he's also a leader of the Justice and Development Party, which is an Islamic-based party. So in Turkey, over 90% of the people are Muslims, and there's a tiny number of Christians, and then a lot of people who are atheists. However, Turkey is one of the most secular countries in the Muslim world, and the Turkish Republic was founded in 1922, and it was the first Muslim country to become secular. Well, apart from Azerbaijan, but the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic didn't last 2 years. As in, people are free to practice whatever religion, but the state will not support or oppose any religion. And previously, in Islamic countries, it was always a Shariat state, that the law of the land was based upon religious law, the Quran. And obviously, there's a great deal of debate about what exactly Shariat law requires. But anyway, Turkey wasn't like that. Now, Erdogan's not talked about bringing back in Sharia law, but he has chipped away at the edges of secularism, which some people found deeply concerning. And there was a law saying there could be no religion in politics, and many people felt that Erdogan's party was meddling with that and was stealthily reintroducing Sharia law. But I think that was a little bit alarmist. So he wasn't bad at the start, and indeed he's had many accomplishments, but he started to turn into much of what his enemies always accused him of being. So his Justice and Development Party, well, they're supposed to be about social justice, about the common weal, but also about economic growth, hence the light bulb as their symbol. And they've achieved a great deal of success insofar as emigration's gone down. A huge number of Turks used to move abroad in search of better opportunities. Remember 1963, the guest worker scheme in Germany started, and millions of Turks moved to Germany and other European countries, and many became citizens. So emigration's down, inflation is fairly low. The economy's taken a bit of a hit this year. Unemployment is quite low, and remember the economic situation in Turkey as recent as the 80s used to be dreadful. They used to have hyperinflation, they used to have high unemployment. It used to be, well, if it was Europe at all, just about the poorest country in Europe. And Turkey is a large country, east to west, almost 1,000 miles, got 80 million people. So there's a great deal of diversity in a country of that size. You just see so much building going on. It's got some global brands like Turkish Airlines. I first flew on them in 2000, and it really was just a regional airline. And now it has a global reach. It goes to every continent, and not just a token flight, plenty of them. And even Turkey's football teams are performing very strongly. It attracts a lot of players from abroad. So Turkey's got turbocharged economic growth, though, as I say, it has wobbled in recent years. So he was mayor of Istanbul, and then he controversially published a poem about our minarets being our bayonets and so on. And that was banned. He got into trouble because the government, which was rigidly secular, felt that this was encroaching on the secular character of the state and was creeping back towards Sharia law. So he's obviously a practicing Muslim. He's open about that. That's fine. You're allowed to be a practicing Muslim. Many people are nominally Muslim. They'll have a party at Eid, and that's it. And they will eat all the way through Ramadan. In the daytime, they might cut down on the reka, stuff like that. Alcohol allowed by law. A man only allowed to have one wife. Equality between men and women before the law. They weren't allowed to wear hijabs, their headscarves in any public building, lest that somehow undermine the secular nature of the state, things like that. So if you wanted to do Ramadan, that's fine. That's the Muslim month of fasting. But the government was not going to facilitate you. No prayer rooms in any public places. No prayer call. It was like that. So very much separation between mosque and state. But Erdogan's wife is seen in public with him a lot, and she wears a hijab, and she dressed very modestly. So that sent a symbol to some. And there are those who campaign for Turkish women to be allowed to wear hijabs in public buildings. Even some women who don't wear them themselves, but they feel that others should have the right. Some people have made a mockery of the law by wearing a wig. So it's achieving the same objective, and there's no law against a peruke in public places, but they are not actually wearing a hijab, so the law doesn't cover that, which I suppose shows the law's absurd. It's asinine that you can wear a periwig but not a headscarf. Why shouldn't you be allowed to wear a headscarf? A really free society would permit that. The odd thing is other secular countries like, say, France allow headscarves. They don't allow veils. Or England, the only officially Christian country in the world, and I do mean England, not the United Kingdom, allows headscarves, even allows jilbabs or face veils in public buildings, which is perhaps too liberal. Anyway, so Erdogan, he had a good relationship with the Gulen Foundation, founded by Fethullah Gulen, who now lives in Pennsylvania, who's about 80 years old now. So it was a progressive Islamic organization. They're practicing Muslims, but they believe that Islam is entirely compatible with modernity and with science. And that's why so many of their members are teachers, engineers, and things like that, and has many schools around the world. But so they had more or less the same agenda, trying to bring Islam into the public space a bit more, not found a Shariat state, say we believe in evolution and so on, and we accept equality of men and women. And some of their women don't wear headscarves, women in the Gulen Foundation, but they tend to wear dresses, all skirts all the time, all the way down to the ankles, dressed very conservatively. But they say that women can do any profession they want. So, and try and engage in charitable works, things like that. But there was a terrible falling out between them a few years ago. It seems odd because their worldview is largely consonant, but people say that's simply a personality clash between them. This Islamist movement wasn't big enough for the both of them. Islamist might be too strong a word because they're not theocrats, they're not radicals. So you have people who are absolutely secular on one side, you have people who kind of want to go back to the Middle Ages on the other side, and maybe Erdogan is somewhere in between the two. But he's not Osama bin Laden. I was hearing these absurd things on Russian television about 3 years ago, saying that he was like that, which is just ridiculous, despite the fact that ISIS was setting off bombs in Turkey and killing scores of civilians, or that he was going to turn it into Saudi Arabia. So don't believe some hyperbole you hear from his implacable foes. So the Erdogan government's often been accused of neo-Ottomanism. Remember, there's the Ottoman Empire, which is only formally dissolved in 1922, which ruled much of the Middle East. One time it's extended from Morocco to Iraq, or from the gates of Vienna down to Yemen. One time, theoretically, even reached into Uganda, since Egypt was supposedly under Ottoman suzerainty. So, yes, he's tried to increase the country's global reach, and they've been involved in other countries' affairs. For example, encouraging the Arab Spring seemed to go badly for them, and trying to help one side out in the Somali civil war, the more moderate one. But I think that they're not trying to conquer everywhere, but they often display the flags of many Central Asian nations, the Turkic nations, and recognize their historic and linguistic links to all the countries of Central Asia. Remember, the Turks started out in what's now Turkmenistan 1,000 years ago and moved out in all directions, north, south, east, and west. Yes, east into China, hence the Uyghurs, who speak a Turkic language, are related to the Turks, but that's why Uyghur is a Turkish surname, and like Cenk Uyghur. And you even occasionally meet a Turkish person who looks East Asian, according to their phenotype. It's not clear what a Turk is supposed to look like because they're not really an ethnicity, they're more of a linguistic group. So the Turkish Republic was founded in 1922, and until then, the Ottoman Empire had been based on Islam. The Turkish language had many Arabic accretions, and it underwent purification. In the 30s, was purged of many of these Arabic loanwords, and they dropped the Arabic script, adopted the Latin script under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of the Turkish Republic. That's why he took the surname Ataturk, as in father of the Turks, upon himself. So they had to create an identity. Well, it couldn't be around being a Muslim because it had to be a secular state. And they wanted to be Western in many ways, not quite so much replicate the political structures, But in terms of even dress, that's why the fez was banned, or the tarbush, you might call it, that red conical hat with a black tassel as a symbol of being backward looking. What else? To wear Western clothes and in many ways ape the Occidentals. So things about the distinctively Turkish about culture, they weren't going to adopt those. They wanted classical music and so on. So what was going to unite people? Well, then it had to be the language. And remember, in the 1920s, a lot of people in Turkey did not speak the Turkish language. They spoke Kurdish, they spoke Greek, they spoke Azerbaijani, which is a dialect of Turkish. Some of them even spoke Georgian, Bulgarian, I can't think, Arabic, various other languages. And so the Turkish language had to be promoted and the other ones discouraged. And all signs up, citizens speak Turkish, and Turkish is the only language of the country. You cannot divide the country geographically, as in suggests separating off some of its land, or indeed by class or faith or anything else. The unity of that is absolutely paramount. It's a bit like France, a republic one and indivisible, and to some extent they had regard for France and based themselves on the French Republic. Anyhow, in 2016 there was an attempted military coup against Erdogan, and this was the third such happening in Turkish history. The last was the 1981, but anyway, it was quickly defeated. It was put to flight in a matter of hours. They attempted to bomb him and kill him when it was at a resort at Marmaris. It was in July, so holiday season, but they failed. They didn't seize the airport, Ataturk Airport, or they didn't shut down the internet and mobile phones, and communications were very fast. So he took the initiative. He flew back to Istanbul. They blocked the two bridges over the Bosphorus that separates the European from the Asian side in Istanbul, and had soldiers standing there, not knowing what they're doing, just following orders. The poor conscripts were mere dupes, and that was that, and it collapsed very quickly. It's thought only about 1/3 of senior officers were on board with the coup, or maybe the others were not even aware, because he was about to demote some of them, and they decided to move quickly. So they had to bring it forward, the whole timetable, before they lost their position, their ability to command so many soldiers. So the soldiers on the bridge surrendered. A lot of the top people were arrested. They're facing trial. Turkey's restored the death penalty. I don't think any death sentence has actually been awarded. Certainly none have been executed. So following this, there was a huge purge of journalists, teachers, civil servants, judges, army officers, anyone he suspected might have any connection to it. Turkish officers in the NATO headquarters in places like Belgium were summoned back, and some went back and have been imprisoned. A few of them exonerated and set free. So some people said that it was a stunt. It was just to provide him an excuse to get rid of anyone he thought was not actively pro his agenda. I don't buy that one myself. And the other thing is that I forgot what else I was going to say apart from the whole thing being a stunt. I think it was real. Otherwise, it would have succeeded. What is very different from the previous attempts, like the 1980 coup. The cousters got the green light from Washington to go ahead, and all the rest of it. The economy was in free fall back then. A very different situation, 2016. But some people felt that he had imperiled the secular settlement of the Turkish Republic. So people have complained about creeping totalitarianism in Turkey, and that is an issue. I mean, I sometimes had things flash up on my laptop when I was there saying, this website is under investigation by the court of first instance. So there are lots of things you're not allowed to say. Now, that was always the case in Turkey, but unfortunately it's got worse in recent years. So people are accusing him of being a fascist and so on, but that's too much. But he is an authoritarian, and it's worrisome. And it's true they have elections. It's questionable how free they are. Like, though he lost his party lost the mayoralty of Istanbul, and he said it's must be rerun because of irregularities. Have there been irregularities? I don't know. But there is censorship. There are also things you can't say. You can't say there was an Armenian genocide, though the Turkish government, they acknowledges that hundreds of thousands of Armenian civilians were killed in the First World War, but they claim it's not tantamount to genocide and blah, blah, blah. So you can't express an opinion about a historical event. There's a law against insulting Turkishness when that is understood very broadly. Freedom of speech is seriously curtailed. You're allowed to criticize Ataturk, apparently, but not to demean him. Well, I think, in effect, if you criticize him at all, that is considered demeaning him. The journalist Rupert Colville wrote years ago that he got two cats, wanted to call them Mustafa and Kemal, as in the names of Ataturk, his personal names, but he was warned that would be a matter for the police. You don't mess around with that. You don't take the mick out of the founder of the state, or that's jail time. So it's worrisome. So because in a sense it's a fairly new state, a fairly new identity, because there was the Ottoman Empire before, and people like even Ataturk himself was born in what's now Greece, half Albanian, and I can't think it's half Macedonian. There are some Macedonian Albanians. So in that sense, he wasn't even Turkish. Because it's a fairly new, brittle state, they've had to manufacture the identity, a bit like the United States. And as I say, you get many different phenotypes in Turkey. People are whiter than me, people are very brown, people are every shade in between, and different facial features and so on. So they don't really have an appearance in that sense. So they came from Central Asia, obviously intermarried with Persians, with Arabs. They raided for slaves all over Europe, Russia and Romania and Italy and Spain and whatever. So some of them are very white because of that. Some African people came to Turkey voluntarily and also as captives. So they're a very much ethnically mixed country. And the wonderful thing is it doesn't seem to cause any problems. There's a Kurdish minority, and for decades they weren't even allowed to call themselves Kurdish, had to call themselves Mountain Turks, and their language is firmly discouraged. And even a woman who dared to speak it in Parliament, she was shouted at, arrest her, terrorist, traitor, and so on. There we are. So people have said there's this incipient Sharia state, and it is a bit worrying. He tried to have adultery outlawed. It's an encouraging sign that he failed in that attempt a couple of years ago. Shows that it's not a totalitarian state, that there is a private sphere. Or his party sometimes has outlawed alcohol in certain localities. They're not proposing to do it across the country. But some people say that's the thin end of the wedge. If you ban it in this municipality, you'll do it in the next and the next and the next, and before you know it, it'll be outlawed everywhere. And the people like him are opposed to the values of the Enlightenment. Obviously, tourism is big business in Turkey, and they don't want to put off the tourists. So that's one of the reasons why they're not doing it. So he had a terrible spat with Putin in 2015. They were almost at war over a Russian airplane that was shot down over Turkish airspace. Saber rattling, but they've since kissed and made up and get on very well indeed. Now, Turkey, I've got to admire their restraint. They stayed out of the Syrian civil war. They used to have very cordial relations with the Assad government. But then the Arab Spring broke out. Obviously, it's on their doorstep, the fighting in Syria, which spilled over into Turkey, and tens of thousands of Syrian refugees came to Turkey, and they demanded real reform, not the pretend reforms that Assad had been talking about for 11 years. You've got to have real elections. You can't have no freedom of speech at all. No wonder people are furious. And even with massive foreign support, Assad is clearly hated by huge numbers of his own people, despite the Russian Air Force, the Iranian army, Iranian Revolutionary Guards, Chinese money. Despite that, after 8 years and hundreds of thousands of dead, Assad still doesn't control the whole of his country, which shows just how deep this hatred of him runs. That doesn't come from nowhere. There's got to be some good reason. He can't be a good president like that. He might be better than the alternative, but come on. And so the Turks, I suppose, were perhaps minded to intervene, and indeed they have. And they do occupy a very small section of northern Syria, where there's a Turkoman ethnic minority. Remember, they're ethnic Turks or linguistic Turks. I could call them in Iraq as well. In Iran, only very few. So Erdogan, he's fallen out with Sisi, Fatah al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, who was a military ruler. But Turkey has very good relations with Iraq, which borders them, of course. They're very anti-ISIS as well. So don't give me this nonsense that he really wants to set up some sort of ISIS state. And obviously music and dancing is allowed in sport, and women can wear what they want in Turkey. So it's the streets ahead of many Muslim countries. Although he's bad, I don't think he's downright abysmal. Could get a lot worse. Not too keen on the Kurds, and obviously the Kurdish rebellion has started again, the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, and he's saying they're terrorists and so on. The Peshmergas in northern Iraq, who are the most gallant fighters against ISIS, but he doesn't recognise their heroism, and he's intervened and fought against them, but they've killed Turkish troops. And I don't have much time for the PKK. They've done lots of bad stuff. And not just drug dealing, but killing those Kurds who are not willing to go along with their agenda. I don't have a strong view whether there should be an independent Kurdistan or not. I mean, in northern Iraq, Kurdistan has been independent for almost 30 years, and even on a referendum voted to be independent recently. But Turkey's worried because the Kurds would claim something like a quarter of Turkey. A lot of Turkish citizens are ethnically Turkish. Some of them are okay living in Turkey, don't really mind, willing to think that the two identities are compatible, and they can all speak the Turkish language as well. But the Kurdish homeland would partly be in Syria and partly be Iran as well. So the Kurdish nationalists seem to be neutral in the Syrian civil war, and then effectively control a lot of that country. So Erdogan, rather, I believe is bad news. I'd rather he was got rid of. You judge him by the company he keeps. He makes some pretty nasty friends. He's backing up Qatar, and it's spat with Saudi Arabia because Qatar is not towing their line on Iran. Saudis have accused the Qataris of backing terrorism, which is a bit rich coming from them. But the Turkish troops in Qatar, which is a security guarantee, it discourages the Saudi Arabians from invading. The Saudi Arabians have seized their land before. They've intervened militarily in Bahrain in support of the government there, a Sunni government over a Shia majority. So they would like to see the Gulf as the Arabian Gulf as their lake, and Erdogan and Qatar are not letting them do that. So for that, at least I thank him. Qatar is largely a dictatorship, but it's still better than Saudi Arabia. So there we are. He's overall he's fairly bad news. He's 65 years old. He's been on a state visit to the United Kingdom a few years ago. Perhaps he shouldn't have been so honoured, but he's not as dreadful as his foes paint him.